Hello, everybody. Good to see you. My name is Nate. If I haven't met you, I want to welcome everybody who's joining online. I'm going to need to apologize. I've been fighting a cold the last half of the week, but I'm going to get through this, okay? Hey, before we jump into this, we're in this series called Threads, where we're looking at the Bible in these amazing, big picture, meta-narrative threads that God weaves throughout the Bible. And today we're starting a whole new grouping of those, calling it Empires, Kingdoms, and Realms. We're going to talk about Judges and Kings today. But while I was away this week at meetings in Los Angeles, our team put together a recap video of our first groupings of threads. And when I saw it, I thought, oh, that's worth watching. Our first series was about nature, and we've got sheep and vineyards and all these things. So would you just watch this, just a good visual reminder, and then we're going to jump into Judges and Kings.
Nature. The sound of thunder rumbling through a valley during a summer storm. Birds chattering and calling in the treetops. The sound of leaves in an aspen tree as they sway in a summer breeze. The smell of spring as new life fills the air. God uses nature to communicate to us. Throughout the threads and themes in Scripture, there are details woven into the story that sometimes we miss at first glance. Yet, when we zoom out, we can see reflections and symbolism of a grand invitation, the story of God being told over centuries. In the garden, there's a picture of choice and life. Will we choose our way or God's way? Will we step back into the place of resurrection where new life meets us in our place of need? Through trees, we see a picture of something that's always giving of itself. We can either try to earn and achieve something, or we can receive the gift of new life. Through sheep, we see the picture of innocence, both giving itself for others, but also an example of a life choosing to absorb and take on the evil, replacing evil with good. And in the vineyard, there's an invitation to let the gardener help us grow through pruning and shaping. Will we be connected to the source, or will we go our own way? The pictures we see through these threads of nature help us understand the bigger picture, a God who continually restores and renews and is making all things new.
Beautiful. Makes you anxious for spring, doesn't it? Yeah. Hey, in this next grouping, we're going to be talking about kingdoms and empires and even the spiritual realm. And I want to just focus today on human leadership, because this is a definite theme that flows through the Bible. We're going to talk about, in particular, judges and kings, and eventually we get to this point where there's a new leadership structure that God creates in the church, and Jesus is the head of the church. But there's a little bit of a journey we go on before we get there. So if we reviewed human history, we have had so many experiments in what should leadership look like, what does leadership look like. There's been numerous catastrophes. If you live in the Ukraine today, you're wondering, have we not learned anything over thousands of years of human history? That a leader can determine that his narcissistic tendencies and desires overrule a general population. I mean, we're still in the heart of this mess today. We've had republics and democracies and democratic republics, and last century, we're supposed to be advancing, but we tried this thing called socialism, where we thought, hey, if we could just get everybody to the same level, we'd all get along really well. But we found out that might be the most predatory form of leadership that's ever existed. It ruined cultures. That's kind of the story of the Bible, right? It's the story of our lives. So there are three things that occur before we get to a new organization that Jesus is going to build. And we're just going to review these quickly. The first one that we read of is God desired for us to originally live in a theocracy, okay? Now, this is not a biblical word, but theos is a Greek name for God. And it's where God leads, where he rules. And as we've been going back to so often, in the Garden of Eden, God said, just let me lead you, okay? Could you trust me? But there's this inclination within the human heart that says, no, I choose autonomy. I choose to decide my own ethics, what's good for me, what I want to do. And so we have rejected this theocracy, which led human beings out of the garden, driven east, away from the presence of God. And then these leadership structures, typically who's the strongest or who's the smartest, rises to power, and then they use their power for their own well-being. Well, God would come back into people's lives, Abraham, and he'd say, would you live in a theocracy with me where I could lead and you would follow? Moses, how about you follow me? And so there's these ongoing experiments, which we get then to the people of Israel who have been slaves for 400 years in Egypt, and they're coming out of Egypt, and God says, let's try this again. Moses will be my representative, but you won't have a king. Let me be your king. Let's establish a new nation. Let's establish a new way of living where you can trust me. So the book of Exodus is this 40 years of wandering through the wilderness, and here's what happens regularly. The people reject God as their leader. They want tangible expressions of God. So they create golden calves. They want things that they can manipulate. Rather than serve God, we want God to serve us, and we want to make a God in our image, right? In our image. And so this story goes over and over, and God's still saying, let me lead you, let me lead you. Well, advance, and then we get to this kind of next series structure of leadership. They're still in the oversight of a theocracy, but now it's judges. Okay, judges. If you are new to the Bible, or if you've noticed that your 15-year-old son or grandson suddenly has like a deep interest in the Bible, it's likely because he's reading the book of Judges, right? If there was a rating system in the Bible, we would have to give the book of Judges PG-13 at least, okay? At least. Here's what happens. In the midst of their theocracy, they're living in the land, and here's the key verse. It occurs 4 different times in the book of Judges. We'll read it from chapter 17, verse 6. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit. You know what we call this today? Moral relativism. This is back to the Garden of Eden, where rather than saying, God, you determine what I was made for, we do what we see as being fit. We develop our own ethics and our own values and our own systems for operating. And so it leads to this absolute chaos where this verse is recorded 4 different times. So I'm going to draw you a picture. You'll always remember the book of Judges. The book of Judges is this spiral that ends, the very last chapter, I would argue, is the most disturbing, most violent, most awful chapter in the entire Bible. There are 12 different judges, and here's what the system looks like. The people are living in relative freedom. They choose to disobey God. They choose autonomy. Leads to captivity. They often will absorb other gods. They'll start to worship the Canaanite gods, the Philistine gods. And then these people then end up capturing them. They repent, there we go. And they cry out to God. God then sends them a judge. And these judges, they're men and they're women. And this is what we read. It says, and the Spirit of God would come upon the judge, and usually there's some sort of military feat. There's something incredible. But these judges are flawed people. The first 3 seem to be okay, they're okay. And then after that, the next several, it deteriorates. You've got people like Samson in here. You've got people like Deborah. You've got people like Gideon who have deep, deep compromises. But the judge would bring some sort of freedom. But guess what happens? They just go back to the same thing. And it goes on and on through hundreds of years of human history to the point where at the end of the book, it just seems absolutely hopeless. The best leaders out there end up being self-serving, and they end up being oppressive to the people, Okay, so we have a theocracy, and then when we reject God as our leader, God says, okay, try these judges. That's not a great experiment. So we move to the third thing, and this is very common. This is throughout human history. It's a monarchy. A monarchy, where there's this idea that there is one individual, one male, one female, who has an extraordinary lineage, an extraordinary capacity, is endowed with power by God, is whatever it might be. And in the monarchy, you have one human being who can decide how the rest of the culture should operate, right? And this is what most cultures have done. Even if it's tribal, it's kind of like your chief is your monarch, but a monarch. Now, here's how we get to this place. People of Israel, after this experiment with the judges, after rejecting a theocracy, say, you know what? We want to be like the nations that surround us. They all have a king. And so God relents eventually, and I want us to read from the book of 1 Samuel. It's this really interesting passage, 1 Samuel chapter 8. Samuel is a prophet. We'll talk about that next week. That's one of these leadership structures. And the people come to Samuel and they go, give us a king. We want a monarch. We're tired of trying to be led by God. We're tired of trying to be led by judges. But when they said, give us a king to lead us, this displeased Samuel, the prophet. So he prayed to the Lord. And the Lord told him, listen to all that the people are saying to you. It is not you they have rejected, but they have rejected me as their king. So God gets to the point where he says, they're rejecting my leadership and my rulership in their life. And so we'll give them something. And this is what Samuel says, and God gives them a strong warning. He says, any type of kingship, you will pay a price for it. As they have done from the day I brought them up out of Egypt until this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so they are doing to you. Now listen to them, but warn them solemnly, and let them know what the king who will reign over them will claim as his rights. Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking him for a king. He said, this is what the king who will reign over you will claim as his rights. He will take your sons and make them serve with his chariots and horses, and they will run in front of his chariots. Some he will assign to be commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s, and others to plow his ground and reap his harvest. And still others to make weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. And if you continue to read, it goes on. He said, he'll take your daughters and he'll bring them into his kitchens to bake bread for him and his armies. So God says this, you can have a king if you want it, but you have to understand that every human role of leadership ends up being oppressive. That the king will say, I have rights as the selected unique people, and there will be an oppression that happens to the people. So who's the first king they choose? They choose this guy named Saul, who is tall and handsome, and when you look at him, you think, oh, there's a kingly type guy. Now, they didn't give him an IQ test. Right? They just chose like, that guy looks like a king, man. I want to follow that guy into battle. Sure enough, this oppression begins to happen. Saul ends up becoming a narcissistic leader, collapses in on himself. So there's a new opportunity for a king. And God says, I'll choose for you this time. And he chooses the unlikely guy named David. David, who's a shepherd, he's not from the right family. He's the last born in the family. And God says this, listen, what you need is you don't need a guy who's powerful and strong. You need a guy who's after my own heart. And so he takes David. David is the epitome of the monarchy. He's what everybody looked back to. And he's this revolutionary man who's a worship leader and a poet, but he's also a warrior. However, even with David, this extraordinary man, his flaws catch up with him. He ends up involved in a murder plot and adultery, and his lusts overwhelm him. So he has a son. His son's name is Solomon, and Solomon's wise, but guess what happens even with this wisdom from God? Solomon begins to build an empire, and he enslaves the people of Israel, conscripts them to come and work for him, and he builds this massive military complex, and the people, although they have their king, are poor, are more oppressed than they have always been. There's just 3 kings in. And then when Solomon dies, his son inherits the kingdom separates into 2. There's a civil war. It becomes the north and the south, Judah in the south, Israel in the north. Each of these 2 kingdoms have 20 separate kings. You can read about this in the book of 1 Kings. 20 separate kings. In the north, there are 20 kings. Guess how many of them finished well, led well? 0. The author goes through all 20 kings. He says, this guy did evil in the eyes of the Lord. This guy introduced, in the north, they actually end up introducing a form of human sacrifice in order to appease the other gods that they are now worshiping. So 0 of them. That kingdom eventually is overcome, taken into exile. The southern kingdom, 20 kings as well. 8 of them do well. 12 of them are failures, right? 8 of them, God would say, he did well or he did righteous in the eyes of the Lord, but 12 didn't. And so you get to this place now where even the southern kingdom is overtaken. So the monarchy was not the answer, all right? So there's a theocracy. Could we find a way to be comfortable living with just God as our leader? There's judges, there's a monarchy, nothing's been perfect. Now we gotta get to point number 4, okay? This is the really, really important point. We're gonna jump forward thousands of years. And we're going to jump into the Apostle Paul's writing from Ephesians and from Colossians and Galatians. And Paul is writing, as he's writing this, here's what you got to keep in mind. He is a part of the Roman Empire. And he is going to use empirical language to describe the person of Jesus. And before we read this, here's what you just kind of just settle in your mind. Paul's saying this. After all these tens of thousands of years of human history, in Jesus, there is a new community of people formed. And it has nothing to do with their ethnicity, has nothing to do with the geography where they live, has nothing to do with their gender, the languages they speak. That Jesus is forming a new community of people, and he's calling it his church. His church, big C. Not just like one local expression, but he's calling it his church, his body. And this is what Paul says happens in the church. So point number 4 is this, is Jesus is the authority of the church. Jesus is the authority of the church. And we'll get to this, and eventually, everything. Let's read Paul's words as he describes this new realm of leadership. Ephesians 1, and God placed all things under his is Jesus, his feet, and appointed him to be head over everything for the church. So he says, when Jesus came onto the scene, here's what God did. He put all authority on Jesus. He appointed him to be the head. Now, it's a body image, right? Hey, I can live without a finger, but the head is the most vital part. He says, and Jesus is in charge of everything. He put it all under his feet. In Colossians, Paul says, and he is the head of the body, using the imagery of a human body. The church, he is the beginning and the firstborn among the dead. It's promised that we all get to be a part of this resurrection that Jesus experienced, so that in everything he might have the supremacy. Using language like this was very dangerous in the Roman Empire because there was one supreme ruler, and that was the emperor of Rome. And here's what Paul says. You are now a part of a different type of kingdom, and Jesus reigns supreme. There is no competition. He is in absolute and total control. And then we'll go back to Ephesians. Paul says this, consequently, you are no longer foreigners and strangers, no longer lost in this array of leadership and which ethnicity am I a part of, but your fellow citizens with God's people, and also members of his household, built on the foundation of the apostles and the prophets, with Christ Jesus himself as the chief cornerstone. So Paul brings in two images that probably aren't as relevant to us, so they're worth exploring. Number one is you're part of his household. His household. So in the Roman world, it was paternalistic, right? So there's a man who's kind of at the top of everything. It's the grandpa, it's the dad, whatever it is. And all authority flows from him. And here's what Paul says. Listen, like you came from your own dysfunctional, semi-functional homes. And what Jesus is now doing is he's creating a new family. And he's bringing in people from all over the place. And it's not just like who your parents were or what you did or what you achieved. He's bringing human beings in to be sons and daughters, and he will serve as the father of this new household. And when you're a part of a household, that means you have someone who is rooting for you. I love what Mark just shared up here while he was leading that ministry time. You have someone who's there for you, who embraces you, who supports you, who loves you, who supplies you with what you need. So he says Jesus is the head of this new house, and you're a part of it. And then he uses a building image. He says Jesus is the chief cornerstone. So in our day and age, we build with wood typically, but the only thing that's kind of like building with a cornerstone would be a foundation, right? So you have to pour a foundation. I used to work construction every summer while I was in high school and college. And one day we showed up on a site, and the foundation crew had been there. And I learned a new word this day. Something was wrong with the foundation. I didn't know enough, but my boss goes, "This thing is cattywampus." Okay, which means there's something wrong with it. I didn't know exactly what was wrong with it, but it's cattywampus, okay? Cattywampus. And what that meant is when the foundation was off, it was gonna make everything so much more difficult. It jeopardizes the structure. Well, in the ancient world, if you were gonna build something really significant, you built with blocks of stone. And the most important block of stone, you would take so much time with this, would be the chief cornerstone. So you would pick one corner of the building. If you went to Jerusalem today, the walls that surround the temple complex, there is a cornerstone that is massive. It's about as long as 2.5 school buses parked next to each other, back to nose to tail. And it's probably 16 feet high. I mean, tons and tons and tons. But here's what you do. This cornerstone had to be absolutely level. I mean, you couldn't have any fall. And it had to be completely flush and plumb. Because it was upon this cornerstone that the rest of the structure would be built. So Paul brings this image into the first century people's minds. He says, I want you to understand in the midst of all the chaos and all the leadership experiences in the past and the monarchies and the empire that they're a part of, he says, I want you to see that Jesus is building something brand new, and he himself is the chief cornerstone, perfectly plumb and straight and level, that now something can be built upon it. The church can be built upon it. So Jesus is the new king. He's the new king. However, we got to move towards some application, right? Because how many of us would say, all right, if Jesus is king of the church, that means that this place should be the most amazing, beautiful, kind, people prospering and flourishing place of all times. Has anybody, don't raise your hand, anybody ever been a part of a church where it was anything but beautiful and flourishing and human prospering? It was painful, and why did that happen? So here's where we live, okay? If you're a follower of Jesus, and I understand some of us are spiritually unresolved, and so you're in this side is not balloons, these are power structures, okay, power structures. You live in a power structure. I live in a power structure. There are civic power structures in my life. There are people that make sure that I don't drive too far over the speed limit, and I don't break certain health codes, and And I mean, think of all the civic rules that we have. There's authority figures there. There's political, okay? Lots of political. At a county, a city, a state, a national, international level, there's all kinds of layers of political authority. There's employment. Okay, if you're the boss of your organization, you still report to the IRS, right? If you're like just beginning a career, you're like way down on the flow chart, and you've got all kinds of people that are telling you what to do. There's family. Like all of us, we have dynamics in our family and people who feel like they need to tell us what to do. There's, in the world, like if you're renting, you've got a landlord. If you're buying, you've got a mortgage. And you've got this beautiful thing called a home owners association. It tells you what color you can paint your house, things like that. In business, we have all these layers, any bank accounts you have, any loans you have. And then we have these interesting ones like entertainment. We have an entire industry of leaders and influencers who tell us what's cool, right? I just saw a bunch of kids at a state basketball tournament with mullets. And I'm like, bring it back. Like, that's fantastic. But I have a feeling they saw someone in the entertainment world with a mullet and they're like, it's back, right? Cultural. This is like kind of a brand new phenomenon for me. I don't really understand, but you could make a really like slick TikTok video and be a social media influencer. And you could tell millions of people how to live their lives. And we don't know anything about you, but you look good on a camera, right? And so all of these pressures, this is where we live, right? All of this influence and leadership over our lives. So here's the tension. I mean, Paul is emphatic that Jesus is king of the church. Why does it get difficult? It gets difficult, in my opinion, 2 reasons. One is we bring some of these values of leadership, judges and kings, might is right, and we bring it into the church. And we lead in a way differently than Jesus leads. Jesus is king. How did he become king? Not by overwhelming the Roman Empire, but surrendering his life to it and winning a battle that had nothing to do with swords, but had everything to do with sacrifice and humility. But we find ourselves bringing these leadership concepts into the church. And here's the other challenge. I think sometimes we as the church feel a little bit insecure, just like the people of Israel. And we say, hey, it's nice to have Jesus as king. We're in a renewed theocracy. But we want a human king. We want somebody to tell us what to do and how to do it. So we create hierarchical structures in the church which actually inhibit the life of Jesus leading us as a church. Because anybody you put in between Jesus and the church is going to be flawed and is going to experience failure. So what's the solution? As we think through this, here's what we want. If Jesus is creating a new community, he's created a new kingdom, and he's the king of this kingdom, here's where we want the influence to go. Instead of being influenced from there into the church, this is when the church is at its very best. When someone has Jesus as king and into their classroom, they're not just there to collect a paycheck, but they're gathering kids together and educating them, but bringing something of the kingdom where Jesus reigns into that classroom. Where it's more than you pay me. I bring the kingdom of God into this classroom of kids, into the business, into, if you're a nurse, if you're a doctor, you're a lawyer, if you're a builder, whatever it might be, if you're farming, whatever it is I'm not just experiencing this, I am bringing into this industry something of the kingdom of Jesus because he reigns in my life. He does not reign in this sphere in entirety yet, does he? He doesn't. But I'm part of his house. And I'm a servant of his kingdom. Therefore, I interject a new set of values where I don't think there's ever a believer in Jesus who can run a simply for-profit business. You run a more than profit business, right? You make a profit, but that's not all we're here for. I'm here to change lives. I'm looking at one of my friends back there, leads an exercise gym. You walk into that gym, man, he makes a living at it. But the two of them together are bringing the kingdom of Jesus into this realm where people are experiencing something you cannot experience in this dynamic. Now, one final thought. One day, this is what Paul says in another place. He says, one day, when Jesus comes back, he's here for the second time in his undiminished glory. He will return as king. And at that time, every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. It's kingship imagery. But until that happens, this world will exist. You know why I think it's got so messy during COVID, even in the church? It's because we kept bringing stuff over here, right? Until Jesus comes back for the second time, it's people who know Jesus is king, bringing his new set of values into this world. And yes, it will feel awkward and strange. But there is beauty that can happen in the midst of this.